Hello, my name is Jeff Steinburg. I want to welcome you to a very special edition of the LaRouche Connection. Today, it is my great privilege to introduce as our guest for the next hour Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, a distinguished career military officer, an historian, an author, an expert on the international railroad industry. Some of you may be familiar with Colonel Prouty from his 1970s book, The Secret Team, which has now recently been republished and is once again available. And of course, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people in the United States and around the world are familiar with Colonel Prouty as the real live character upon whom the figure of Mr. X in the recent Oliver Stone movie JFK was based. Colonel Prouty has recently published a new book called JFK, the CIA, and the plot, the CIA, Vietnam, and the plot to kill John Kennedy. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Colonel Prouty here to the show today. I thought that it would be sensible, rather than giving a long sort of a curriculum vitae introduction, to ask you to start off by telling our audience a little bit about yourself, your career, because it is so extraordinary and is such an important backdrop to the discussion that we're going to have about the book today.
You know, Jeff, I came on duty actually as an Army cavalryman. I've ridden horses as far as 600 miles, you know, day after day. Started with that, went into tanks, so I was on duty before Pearl Harbor. And after that, I went through flying school, and I was based in Cairo. And one day I was asked to pick up a team of people that were going on a trip, and they were a geological survey team going into Saudi Arabia to look at the oil fields there during the war. And then we came back and we found out that Roosevelt, Churchill, and Chiang Kai-shek were having a conference in Cairo, the Cairo Conference of World War II, and that the geological survey people made a report to Roosevelt, who ordered immediately a 50,000 barrel a day refinery to be built in Saudi Arabia. And that started that big Saudi Arabian oil boom that we've seen since then. So when you take part in something like that early in your career, you're kind of interested in the way things develop. And a morning or two later, after the Cairo conference ended, I was told to get my plane ready. Went out to the plane, and they brought a Chinese delegation out there. And we flew to Tehran. I didn't know what was going to happen in Tehran, but I had just been ordered to fly there. En route, I stopped at Habaniyah in Iraq, and a plane came in with an old friend of mine flying it, and Elliott Roosevelt. So I introduced Elliott Roosevelt to the Chinese. But do you know, to this day, you cannot find in a history book that the Chinese were at the Tehran conference with Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. I know one book printed by the US government that corroborates that. Of course, I have pictures, and my co-pilot and my crew were there. But part of the Tehran conference business was to make plans for the Far East after World War II. So you begin to think about how these things happen when they come up like that. And I was in Japan at the end of the war. We were bringing the POWs out as soon as we could. And I went back to Okinawa, where we were based, and they were loading ships with this enormous stockpile of equipment that was to be used to support the invasion of Japan, 500,000 men, and we didn't need it. So I was talking with the harbor master in Naha, and I said, what are you going to do, run that all back to the States? He said, hell no. He said, half of this is going up to Seoul, Korea. And he said, the other half we're sending down to Hanoi. Half of what we were going to use to go into Japan went to Korea, and half went to Hanoi. This was September 2nd of 1945, and those plans were in being at that time. Now, who made those plans? Truman had been president for only a few months. I doubt that he did, but you know, who made the plans for that? Because a little later came the Korean War, and they used the weapons we sent there. Came the war in Vietnam, and Ho Chi Minh was using the weapons we gave him. He used them against the French. That's why he was able to surprise the French with first-class artillery pieces that they didn't think he had. Then we reversed the field, and we began to back the French to the extent that we spent $2 to $3 billion supporting the French against Ho Chi Minh. In 1954, they were defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh inherited all of the arms they lost, And then from 54 until 65, we were involved in Vietnam, but under the operational control of the CIA, not a military operation. And this gets very important when you see things like that happen because, well, just think of one problem that's in the papers all the time, the POWs and the MIAs. You don't have POWs when you don't have an army there. Just because somebody's working for CIA doesn't give them the status of a POW, and so on. All these things get confused in a historical story that doesn't really make sense. The first military people who went into Vietnam were the Marines at Da Nang in March of 1965. And yet, as John Foster Dulles had made a speech himself, we had been in Vietnam since 1945, 20 years in the preparation, you might say, for this war. And why do I use the word preparation? Because some of the things that were done, like this arms movement and setting up the units in Vietnam before we ever had military people there, took 20 years to do that.
You made a point, by the way, I should just interrupt here because I think it's very important because people may be somewhat misled by the title of the book, which talks about the JFK assassination. I think it's essential to tell people that this is truly an extraordinary history of the entire period of what's been called the Cold War, building up to the Kennedy assassination and beyond. And the question you yourself just posed, who made those decisions? In the very beginning chapter of the book, you use a term that I think was originally coined by Buckminster Fuller, the international power elite. And you talked in what to me was very impressive terms about some of these behind-the-scenes decision makers. You talked about the propaganda schemes that sort of define their world outlook. And I think, you know, maybe it would be worthwhile as we get into this real history of the Cold War to perhaps start out by just telling people a little bit about this international power elite and these propaganda schemes and how some of this thing works.
Well, you know, it's very common for people to respond when you try to speak that way, saying, oh, well, here's somebody that just believes in conspiratorial theories or is a little bit paranoid. But now we ought to stop and think carefully what we're talking about. All of history has been controlled by powerful figures. Disraeli in the 19th century said, for those people who are not aware of it, if they realize what goes on behind government, they wouldn't believe it. Sun Tzu, the Chinese emperor, said the same thing back in his period. Buckminster Fuller goes back 2,000 years talking about the elite. And in this country today, we recognize the power behind, let's say, lobbyists who are, in a sense, above the government in that they pay special money to the president to get him reelected. They pay special money to senators and congressmen to get them reelected, but to influence legislation in their favor. And there is and has been throughout history an elite that runs countries and the world. What is this one world all about? And if we don't recognize that, it's very difficult to understand the situation we're in.
You make a point several times in the book about the outlook of a British East India Company economist named Thomas Malthus, and you relate his worldview to this power elite and specifically to the kinds of things that went on during the peak of the Vietnam War in the 60s.
You see, by that time in history, the British Empire had been built on the control of the sea. They were able to drive ships around the world. They knew the world was a sphere. Flat world had gone out. But knowing that the world is a sphere is a very important thing for mankind. It means its surface is finite. And if it's finite, then there's not more space over there and more there. It's just so much. So they began immediately to inventory Earth. And this was one of the jobs of the East India companies. And Thomas Malthus, who taught at Haileybury College, which was the East India College, was the director of economics there. And it was his job, he was the first person ever assigned to the job of inventorying the Earth. Where does tin come from? Where does iron come from? And so on. And in the process, they began to find out how many different people there were in the world, how many different types of people, how many races of people. and where everything was, begin to map the world. Well, that's a very important function, but it leads you to one more thing that has governed relationship between countries ever since then, because Malthus came up with this idea that the population is growing ever so much faster than the ability to raise food, and therefore it wouldn't be long before mankind would run out of food and there would be a terrible loss of life. And it was very convenient that Darwin came along, working for the same employer, the East India Company, with the idea that, well, life is a race for the survival of the fittest anyway, and so the fittest survive. Now, those two theories, which are propaganda, sort of made it legal for the people who invaded, the colonialists, to kill off a couple 100,000 people, because first of all, they probably weren't going to get to eat anyway, and certainly they weren't the fittest, because they're not alive now, they're dead, we're the fittest. It backed up the idea of this proprietary colonialism that swept the world from that period right on up into the 19th century, and in some respects applies today, because look what's going on in Europe. Look what went on in Vietnam, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And the feeling was, you know, what they used to call the mere gook idea, that, well, it doesn't matter, they're not going to live anyway. It's a very powerful underpinning to the civilization today.
You point out that, in a certain sense, this 30-year American war in Indochina and this whole process of the preparation for the Korean War, then Vietnam, was going on even before the war ended. And it's quite striking that it seems to me what you're saying is that even though 1944 and 1945, the Soviet Union was still part of the Allied forces fighting against Nazi Germany and Japan, that we were already beginning to prepare the way for the new war, the Cold War, with communism as the big enemy. Is this an accurate characterization?
Well, you are correct. The beginning of the Cold War is indefinite in a sense, but it's not. You can trace it back. I myself, as a pilot, transport pilot, was asked one day to take about 40 transport aircraft to the north of Syria. The general ordered me to go from Cairo, and we were going on the orders of OSS people who were in Bucharest, Romania, who they claimed had released American prisoners who were captured in the Balkans, and the Germans had just been pushed out of the Balkans, and the Russians were on the way in. So in the interim between the two, they brought out about 750 American POWs. And they were on a freight train. And they ran a freight train through Turkey to the northern border of Syria. And we had our planes parked there, and the men jumped out of the train, climbed in our planes, and we started flying them back to Cairo. I noticed on my own plane, there were 5 or 6 men who obviously weren't Americans. They're perfectly willing to talk. I went back and talked with them. They were pro-Nazi Romanians. They were intelligence specialists who were bringing out intelligence files, not only of Eastern Europe, but of the Soviet Union area. In other words, here in September 1944, while we were fighting hard as partners of the Soviet, we were already building up a Nazi base of intelligence against the Soviet. I mean, the Cold War was already in motion. Why don't we take a look at history the way it happened, instead of all these embellishments that are thrown our way? The Cold War started while we were still fighting, and we, in a sense, had allies on both sides, German allies, and we were still allied with the Soviets.